Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 25th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen President Biden making a surprise visit to Kyiv to meet President Zelensky, the discovery of a body in the River Wire confirmed to be missing woman Nicola Bulley, and the death of veteran football commentator John Motson at the age of 77. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Sorcha Bradley and Jamie Timson, and from Daily History Podcast Today in History with the Retrospectors, it's Arion McNicoll. I've heard that show's great. All right, Sorcha, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the future female in North Korea?
A clip from Kim Jong-un's latest military parade last week, Sorcha. So we're in North Korea. There's another military parade, but there was something surprising about this one. Someone surprising on the balcony this time.
Yes, the North Korean leader has been appearing at official military events with his young daughter by his side, prompting suggestions from some analysts that the 10-year-old Kim Joo-ae might be being groomed to be North Korea's next leader. So very little is known about the North Korean leader's children, but she has been seen at a number of events related to Kim Jong-un's nuclear and military ambitions. She was seen for the first time last year, November 22, where she joined her father at the test launch of a missile, and then was seen earlier this month at another significant event, which was the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Korean People's Army. But that also featured the biggest display yet of the country's long-range missiles.
And there's a wider context about this, as you indicated in your little tease there, which is about the future of women in the North Korean leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. Kim Jong-un's sister has also been making headlines this week when she warned that the very secretive state could turn the Pacific into a firing range. That was her words, as North Korea fired 2 ballistic missiles off its east coast. And those words were in response to joint air exercises by the US and South Korea, which were held after North Korea fired an intercontinental missile off their coast.
Okay, so the military aggression is nothing new, Jamie, but the female spokespeople, one of whom a child, kind of is. What do you think is going on?
Yeah, I think there's probably there's two competing thoughts regarding it. One is that it's basically a way of making Kim Jong-un look a bit more cuddly and a bit more presentable. You know, not only is he a man who can fire ballistic missiles at will, he's also someone that loves a doting dad. The other way of looking at this is that actually it's all succession planning, you know, that effectively what he's looking to do is anoint a new successor. I mean, so his father, Kim Jong-il, was introduced to the public in his 30s. Kim Jong-un was introduced in his 20s. And now, I mean, what's great about North Korea in general is that everything we get and all of the knowledge that we seem to have is from former basketball player Dennis Rodman, who basically the only information that we have. And he says that Kim Yoo-ae is about 10 years old. So,
okay, but if it's about looking cuddly, let's take that first one, Arion. Who for? Like, is it for a domestic audience where the people are starving but have to devote their lives to the military service of North Korea, or is it for an international audience to think, there's more to Kim Jong-un than we thought?
It's hard to directly buy that argument, particularly if you think that it's meant to have some sort of international ramification. You could imagine that they want to portray Kim Jong-un in all his complexity to an internal audience, but I don't think that he wants to be giving off anything like a cuddly image to his sort of very few friends and mostly competitors internationally. So I think this looks much more like it's a case of succession planning, not least of all because, for one thing, there have been long questions about Kim Jong-un's health. He's only 39, but, he's long had problems with his weight. That's obvious to everyone, but there have been some suggestions that his health issues might go deeper than that. And so it may be necessary for him, it might be in his brain that it's necessary for him to start making plans for the next generation so that he can hand over just in case the worst happens.
But how realistic is that? So let's say he does have a massive heart attack in the next 2 years, and then suddenly you're looking at a 12-year-old female leader of North Korea. Is the idea then of kind of introducing his sister to say, well, we'll have this girl kind of on the throne, as it were, but look, we've got other responsible people behind the scenes too?
Yeah, I think that's right. Kim Yo-jong, Kim Jong-un's sister, is definitely in a very strong position, and her presence at lots of different events and even in negotiating positions with other countries has been a big source of speculation about what that means for both the family dynamic, but also for this sort of traditionally patriarchal society that North Korea is meant to be, which is also true of South Korea, mind you. And a lot of the speculation about whether it would be possible for Kim Jong-un to hand over to any sort of female has, at least the doubt has been coming from people within the South, many of whom have kind of patriarchal attitudes themselves. So I think that to me, at least, it looks like there could be a female being groomed, although we don't know very much about the Kim family. And there could also be there is suggestion that there is also at least one boy potentially. We just don't know how many children Kim Jong-un has.
So, Sorcha, what are the kind of, I hesitate to say regulations, because obviously it's a dictatorship and he can do what he wants, really. But technically, what's supposed to happen around succession in the Kim dynasty? Is it supposed to be a boy, or has it just always historically been men and it can be a woman?
Yes, Kim Jong-un himself is not the eldest son, and sort of normally in lines of succession you would think it's the eldest son, but it didn't go to his eldest. It didn't go to the eldest son. It went to him. So there is sort of this precedent of people being selected on the basis of sort of who is seen as best for the job.
And I guess, Jamie, what's changed even since Kim Jong-un became supreme leader is we've seen some well-loved women leaders of major political parties around the world. So maybe the context has changed.
Yeah, and I think, you only have to look at the news more recently with people like Jacinda Ardern, like Nicola Sturgeon, of course, are two that come to mind. But we've also seen, strong female leaders. Well, now in Italy with Giorgia Meloni from the other side of the fence. We've got a lot
female
of
vice president in the US.
Female vice president in the US, yeah, exactly. And Nikki Haley looking to take on Trump for the Republican. There is a lot of strong female leadership now across the world. And potentially, this is a look from North Korea at that to say that we can do it too. I think what's interesting, and I was really surprised by when Nicola Sturgeon stepped down and Jacinda Ardern, there's still this same debate. I think the BBC got it in the neck for an article that was headlined, "Can Women Have It All?" or something, basically talking about women's role, if there was a way for them to build a career while still being in leadership. It's terrifying that we still have these conversations and that we still can't get to a situation. But I guess when you look at the way that the media is and you look at the conversations that we're having about North Korea and deeply patriarchal societies, we've still got a long way to go, I think.
Can you have a Korea and also a North Korea? I mean, what's staggering about all this is how much it's all about reading the runes. You know, we have so little idea about what's really going on in this situation. And for example, there was one thing that was taken as being hugely symbolic, which is that Kim Jong-un has appeared on multiple occasions in propaganda videos and in photos sitting on a big white horse. And in the Kim dynasty's version of its own history, the white horse is this kind of metaphor for the family's sacred duty to lead North Korea's charge towards its glorious future. And more recently now, his daughter Jue has been seen not riding the horse yet, but leading her favorite pet, which just happens to be a white horse. And this again is taken as a sort of, indication that this is the direction that the entire kingdom is going. And we just know so little about what is actually going on in there. For example, even her name, Jue, is a thing that we only know, as Jamie says, from Dennis Rodman. She's referred to internally as precious daughter or beloved daughter. She's never actually been, we've never had proper full confirmation of her name. And so I think there's a lot of kind of interpreting that may or may not come to pass. And who knows how long Kim Jong-un himself is going to live. There's many more years ahead before this handover of power is going to take place.
And what else has been going on, Sorcha, in North Korea whilst the world's been distracted, notably with Russia-Ukraine?
There is a suggestion that Kim Jong-un is sort of presenting his daughter to the world as a potential successor in order to distract from the massive problems that are occurring in the country. Starvation is increasingly an issue in North Korea, and that's in part because of the multilateral sanctions that have been placed on the nation by the UN and the US and other countries due to their nuclear ambitions. And by sort of introducing this guessing game of who's going to be the successor, will it be a woman for the first time? Will it be his daughter? Then that totally distracts the Western media from the real issues going on in the country.
Okay. Jamie, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Jamie, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the US Supreme Court about to turn off the internet?
Oh, my brothers, living in the West, I know how you feel when I used to live there. In the heart, you feel depressed. Prophet ﷺ said, the cure for the depression is jihad fi sabilillah.
An ISIS recruitment video from back in 2015. 2015, Jamie, it's too late. You're not going to recruit us to ISIS.
Oh.
But what's the story?
Well, the US Supreme Court is hearing two separate cases involving victims or families of victims who were killed in ISIS attacks, one in Paris in 2015 and one in Turkey in 2017. And the families say that Google, in the form of YouTube, and then in the other one, it's against Twitter and Facebook, but they basically say that the content platforms don't do enough to prevent the platforms from recommending terrorist recruitment and training videos like the one that we heard earlier. It's being heard by the Supreme Court, and it is all surrounds the Section 230 piece of legislation. It's a piece of legislation that was brought in 1996, and it says that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. And it is basically a way of getting these content platforms away with, liability for what's being published on it.
And that act, the Communications Decency Act of 1996, is kind of what underpins all these big American corporates that have provided us with social media and interactive internet services for the last 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're in a situation where you probably wouldn't be able to, without this act, have Amazon or Facebook or Google or any of these big content platforms, because they would immediately have been taken down. And, the reason that the legislation was brought in was because they were worried about speech or things being posted on message boards back then, because we didn't even have things like Facebook or Twitter. It was all just message boards, and whether the people running the message board could be liable for what was being put on there. I think what's interesting about this, and I'm sure we'll broaden it out into discussion further, is we're now looking at regulation for these big companies, and it's been 20 odd years where they've been kind of able to get through scot-free a little bit, a kind of wild west of the internet. And whether anything happens in the Supreme Court this week we don't know yet, but it is a definite trend that we're moving towards.
It's kind of a tweak even though on that discussion, isn't it, Arion? Because in terms of whether a technology platform is responsible for the content it offers up, you understand intellectually the argument, no, we're not, it's up to individuals, and if someone libels someone, you can see who they are, you can see their name, you can sue them, it's not our fault, we weren't able to see what they said before they said it. But this is about an algorithm offering up the video once it's been uploaded. It's not saying that, obviously, YouTube didn't create an ISIS recruitment video. It's saying that YouTube then recommended that video to someone. And that's a bit of code that's doing that. It's not even a person.
Yes, and an algorithm that is notoriously non-transparent. This is one of the big problems in trying to get a sense of what exactly these media and social media platforms are doing. You could easily imagine a circumstance where if someone went in search of, say, fireworks videos and then came to be served then bomb-making equipment, that would be the algorithm actively doing something bad. That would be an intervention from whatever the provider was, say Google if it was YouTube, intervening to provide a piece of its own creation that took people down a path towards something that maybe they shouldn't have been led towards and didn't want to have circulated to them in the first place. But on the other hand, anytime you try to determine what it is these big companies should do in terms of putting regulation in place, then you do start to run into these big, thorny questions. And yes, this legislation came about in the US back in 1996 when the internet was very different to the way that it is today. But I think that they're, having worked for companies like media companies where you're trying to work out to what extent you should allow people to post freely and to what extent you should try to take things down when they're offensive, or problematic in other ways, they're really, really complex questions to resolve. And I can completely understand why the Supreme Court feels like it has its hands full with this one.
And to what extent you should even try and cheat the algorithm, Sorcha. I mean, that's the other thing that media organizations do, isn't it? Sometimes through quite noble purposes, not necessarily just about commercial impacts, but we want our news to reach people. Therefore, we're going to use keywords that people are searching for when they're being recommended a conspiracy. Doesn't mean when they get our news article, they won't get the genuine article, full of facts. But we are manipulating the fact that these websites push you into ever more extreme directions. Like there's a whole industry built up around that now.
Yeah, well, exactly. It's people's entire jobs in many media organizations and social media sites, specifically to, improve what we call SEO, search engine optimizations. So when people are Googling things and looking for things, the content that they want is coming up. The big problem is that, people want to be able to find the content that they want and that looking for. And, it makes sense that companies want to make that as easy as possible. But the problem, I think, is with these sort of murky algorithms that push more and more extreme content often. I think that's been a problem that's often cited with YouTube. Then people's views can, especially young and vulnerable people, their views can become more extreme, or they can be subjected to extremely violent content without ever at any point really intending to go down that path. And I think that's where the main issue lies, is how do we sort of moderate the internet in a way that it means that vulnerable and young people are sort of safe and not seeing extreme content, while at the same time not cracking down on sort of free expression on the internet and hiding content that people want to see. Because that could be a range of things. That could be, things to do with healthcare or abortion or, topics which should not necessarily be seen as controversial, but can become controversial. And it's sort of when you try and these companies are trying to sort of edit the internet too much, then it becomes a free free speech and free expression issue.
But then ISIS, Jamie, were opposed to free speech. ISIS were manipulating the algorithms that were set up for an American democratic way of looking at the world that actually perhaps they never should have been allowed to exploit, because, YouTube were removing beheading videos, weren't they? But it's the nefarious thing, exactly as Sorcha's just describing, of someone's looking for something quite legitimate, like the words Islamic and state, and then gets given an ISIS recruitment video.
Yeah. The big tech companies will always argue that they can't work in the way that they have and provide the services that they can have if this kind of form of regulation comes in. I saw one of the people saying that basically without the algorithm, TikTok would just show you every single piece of content that's been uploaded onto the website. And actually the algorithm is what is helping serve people. So the algorithm needs to exist. I think basically the answer, and from what I've read, is drawing a massive distinction between speech on platforms and conduct. And a good example, and it is the way that Snapchat recently put out a filter that showed how fast you were going. And kind of like the idea was that you were meant to show people how quickly you were going using the filter. 3 teenage boys drove like way too fast using the filter and hit a tree and died. And so while no one is saying that, we want to hold back on speech on some of these platforms, there are ways in which they're pushing and promoting conduct through features that needs to be regulated.
Well, we saw this with Molly Russell, didn't we, Arion? I mean, it took a dogged campaign for years from her father and from the BBC and others to get Instagram and Meta to really actively police the algorithm that was pushing teenage girls into anorexia-based self-harm videos. But it's obviously possible because they've now done it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you consider the group of tech platforms, including Google, Meta, Twitter, Microsoft, Reddit, etc., who have mounted arguments against this. And basically their case is, if you regulate in these particular cases, then the internet will become both disorganized and also a litigation minefield. But at least the plaintiff in the second of the two cases, the Twitter case, says it's important not to get carried away and assume that regulation on this scale will necessarily have broad impacts. And in fact, the inverse is true as well. An indecision or a lack of decision or a decision against these cases by the Supreme Court will also have significant implications. So, whichever way they go, there's going to be some sort of ramifications. But the question is it going to turn the internet into an ungovernable mess if the Supreme Court comes down against the internet platforms this time?
I mean, Sorcha, how do you think this case could shape how the internet looks in the future?
I mean, it could totally change how the internet looks forever if companies made liable for what their algorithms push. Then either, as we were just discussing, maybe they'd get rid of the algorithm and then no one would be able to find anything that they wanted to on social media platforms. But also, I think it could also mean that strict moderation will be enforced, and therefore lots of types of information will no longer be available on the internet, whether they're harmful or not, just because there'll be that fear of litigation in the future. But that's not to say that social media companies don't want there to be some sorts of guidance from lawmakers. Mark Zuckerberg told Congress that he thought it may make sense for there to be liability for some of the content on Facebook, and that Facebook would benefit from clearer guidance from elected officials. So there is, on one hand, a sense that greater guidance, could be beneficial for these companies, but there's also definitely a fear that it, could completely destroy how many of these social media platforms operate.
Jamie, do you trust the Supreme Court justices to be able to get their heads around this issue? I mean, obviously, don't get me wrong, there's very well-prepared counsel and these are intelligent people. But even so, you're talking about people who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s who are judging on this.
Yeah. I mean, one of the justices, Elena Kagan, said just 2.5 hours into the oral arguments, we really don't know about these things. These are not like 9 greatest experts on the internet. which is a damning indictment, really, of the Supreme Court and the justice system more broadly. But I think it's certainly one to watch, because I'm not, as far as I've read, and I don't think we can really be clear which way they'll come down. And I think Sorcha's right to highlight that actually we are at a turning point where even the biggest tech companies and the people that have made billions out of basically us and the algorithms and the lack of regulation, let's be clear, people like Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos have profited from this lack of regulation. Even they are now saying, oh, actually, some regulation of the internet would be good. Who does that regulation, how it comes about, and particularly in the UK with this online safety bill, which is going through Parliament, could be crucial to the future of how we interact with the internet. So not to blow my own trumpet, but this one really does have repercussions for all our lives.
Okay. Arion, you're up next after this. Okay, Arion, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, it was all disquiet on the Western Front.
All quiet on the Western Front.
All Quiet on the Western Front tells a story of young men who, poisoned by right-wing political nationalist propaganda, go to war thinking it's an adventure. And war is anything but an adventure.
Malte Grunert, producer of All Quiet on the Western Front, accepting the BAFTA for Best Film on Sunday. Arion swept the board of the big awards at the BAFTAs, didn't it, this movie? What's the story?
It did, yeah. That bit is quite well reported, that All Quiet on the Western Front, the new German language adaptation of the very famous book, took home 7 of the 14 categories in which it was nominated at the BAFTAs, including Best Film, which makes it the most successful non-English language film in BAFTA history. But the underreported part of it is that it's been incredibly and entirely panned in its native Germany and decried as war kitsch by critics, with many disputing loads of the director's decisions, including things like inventing new storylines and omitting significant characters and crucial scenes, and not always being entirely historically accurate.
Okay, I mean, the historical accuracy, let's park that for a minute, because I understand why people would be upset about that. Inventing new storylines. I mean, the book is fiction. Why can't you do an adaptation? And indeed, they won the BAFTA for Best Adapted Screenplay and put some new storylines in.
It does seem astonishing, especially if you take at face value the criticism of Herbert Wetzel, who's a critic for the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is a broadsheet over in Germany. And he said, at a rough estimate, 8 or more tenths of the film consists of scenes that have not only little but nothing to do with the book at all. He said, if the characters in the film did not have the same names as the book, Paul Baumner, Albert Kropp, Cat, etc., it would be difficult to find any parallels worth mentioning.
That does feel like a very German criticism. I'm going to divide the film into tenths.
yeah, we can simplify down people. But I think, if that is true, and I must say I haven't actually read the book for a long time, but if that is the case, then arguably this is not a great screen adaptation of a famous book, but a new invention. And maybe that's where the criticisms are heading, which is, it's fair enough to make a perfectly good anti-war movie set in the First World War, but can you still call it this name if it has very little to do with the book?
Well, Sorcha, I know you've seen the film. Have you read the book?
Do you know what? I think I might have about 12 years ago, but I've definitely seen the film much more recently.
Okay, so you're in the same ballpark as me. I haven't read the book. I've seen the film. I thought the film was all the things you'd expect a World War I movie to be: devastating, emotional, difficult. Kind of the story, I mean, that's the truth, isn't it? The story is optimistic young men, clean cut, full of beans, go out and die. That's the story, regardless of, whether it's called All Quiet on the Western Front or not. So it ticked the boxes for me.
Yeah, I thought it was an amazing film. I absolutely loved it. I think while I understand if you're a huge, huge fan of the book, you might feel a little shortchanged by some of the changes. I think overall, we read books and we watch films, not necessarily, for total accuracy and total commitment to its source material, but we want to see an expression of these big themes, of these grander themes, of these wider themes. And I thought the film perfectly encapsulated that, the futility of war, like the loss of youth, the dangers of blind nationalism. I think that the film covers all those things beautifully. I think the one element which I think was complained about, which it does totally gloss over, is in the middle of the book, the main character returns home, and it's about how difficult it is to adjust to civilian life, which is, very interesting, moving part of the book. And that isn't addressed in the film, as far as I remember. So I understand why, if that's a particularly beloved section to you, you might feel shortchanged. But overall, I thought it's very close to the themes that the source material wanted to draw out and discuss.
But also, why pick on this one, Jamie? I mean, if you've read books for the last 100 years and then you've watched the films that the books are based on, there's frequently all sorts of bizarre kind of casting decisions. Some of them are recast into musicals. Sometimes they're animated. I mean, an adaptation can be quite fluid, can't it? This isn't unique.
The context, I think, that the film has come out in is really important when we look at this. And I think it's very easy to look at it from a kind of like, classic po-faced Germans not really getting the point of films and actually adaptations and all of that. But the context in Germany at the moment is basically the rest of the West is pushing Germany to engage militarily or as much as possible in Ukraine. Here is a version of one of their kind of like seminal nation texts. I was trying to think before I came on here of what the equivalent would be, but it is akin to rewriting one of Churchill's speeches or doing an adaptation of Churchill from our perspective. So this is a really crucial national text in a national psyche of the German public, and I think when you look at it through the context of that, I think a lot of people think of Germany post Second World War as being incredibly pacifist, and that's not true. There was an amazing article in this week's New Statesman that's worth buying the magazine for alone, by Jeremy Cliff, basically putting the context in Germany around the film and why it's been and regarded. And he points out that basically there's a big divide between, all militarism post Second World War was wrong, and we don't need someone to put out a film saying that there are some things as just wars. And actually, this film is looking at the kind of pointlessness of it, and the new angle that he brings into the film is these politicians, these German politicians who basically take the innocence away from soldiers. It plays a very easy and obvious parallel to nationalistic rhetoric of war, and how it's actually the people in big houses that don't ever have to sacrifice anything that choose who goes about dying. So I kind of, having read this article by Jeremy Cliff, I really now understand more the reaction to it. I do think, though, that in one way, Ollie, you're right in the sense that it's just a film. It doesn't actually matter that much.
It's also a film that Germany itself has put forward, Arion, as their entry for Best Foreign Language Picture at the Oscars, a category which it seems absolutely destined to win, even if it doesn't win Best Overall Picture. So there's obviously people, in the German media establishment that think this is a great representation of German film.
Yes, and the director, Edward Berger, himself tried to sort of come out and say, look, I take your criticism, but the truth is that not everyone hates it. He had a fairly curt reply to some of his criticisms. He said, Germans are always skeptical of ambition. Whenever you try something a little bit different than the norm, they get worried, which sounded like sort of fight and talk that isn't going to have him welcomed back to like the next film festivals that take place in Germany in a hurry.
Can we just talk about the historical inaccuracies alleged? Because those are obviously a bit more serious. What are they saying is just incorrect about the way the film portrays the German war effort in World War I?
There was one in particular, which is that there's a moment where German officers start to shoot dead their terrified and deserting troops. And one historian pointed out that that may have been true of the Second World War. Quite a lot of that went on, but very little of it went on in World War I. And yes, you can take it as a sort of individual case, but when it's being used to speak to a more broad, specifically the idea that all German officers were brutal in this way towards all of their troops, then it's just not true. There was another one, which was that the climactic battle is being fought, if not hours or minutes than, in the day before the armistice came about, and that German officers pig-headedly threw their soldiers to their death, which the book doesn't have,
Spoiler.
Right,
On the final,
yes.
final scene of the film there.
But the book doesn't have that. The main character dies some weeks earlier, before the end of the war. And so...
Yeah, but again, the main character is fictional. But did that happen? I presume it happened.
Well, it happened more on the American side than on the German. There was an American officer that basically said, we go until absolute ceasefire. And there was one private who died mere minutes before the ceasefire was signed. And actually more people died on Armistice Day in the war than on D-Day, which I didn't know until I was reading about this.
Wow, that is a great fact. Yeah, and a horrifying one. I suppose, Sorcha, that mention of America there and how Americans see this is kind of part of this too, isn't it? Because this film was funded by Netflix. Netflix have been quite impressive, haven't they, in managing to penetrate award season? I mean, so many movies now have been funded in that way.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, a film is a very different medium from literature. And you do have to make changes to make films work. I think they generally have to be a bit more dramatic, a bit more exciting than necessarily the source text is. And especially if we look at this film is for a global audience, not just for a German audience, but has to appeal to all sorts of people in all sorts of countries across all sorts of age ranges, then I think you can forgive the director for making it maybe, even more sort of sensationalized and dramatic than the book really is. Because at the end of the day, I think ultimately films and books are there to entertain. They do that in different ways. But in order for them to get their, the heart of their message across, it also has to be entertaining. Otherwise, you're just going to switch off and you're not going to watch it anymore. You're not going to read it anymore. So, but the ways that is done in both mediums can be very different. And I think that's just what's happened here, really.
Do you have a book, Sorcha, that you've been disappointed by the film adaptation of?
Yes, and it hurts my heart to this day. The Hobbit. I'm sorry. The adaptation of The Hobbit, or the 3 films that make up The Hobbit, is rubbish. And Lord of the Rings is so great. Great film.
Okay, so would you have wanted more or less, just to be clear? It was 9 hours long.
Much, much, much less. One film, maybe 2.5 hours, not the 9-hour extremely boring extravaganza that it was, because the book is so great. It's like the perfect children's novel.
Jamie, have you been disappointed by a film, having read the book?
Passion of the Christ. They could have done better with the text.
Compared to the New Testament.
Yeah. Could have done a bit better with the text if you think about it.
Arion?
Everyone always talks about Dune, the David Lynch version that was like an absolute butchery of the book. But personally, I'd say any effort to bring Garfield to the big screen has always been disappointing. His voice is always wrong compared to the one I have in my brain.
Yeah, it's rare, isn't it, when the answer is Bill Murray and it still feels wrong. But you're right.
Right.
Well, that was good, or at least I think 8/10 of it was good. We might have gone off-piste at the end. My thanks to Arion, Jamie and Sorcha. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription. Just go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.